Hello, this is Yummy Pajama Man, and today we're going to learn about scope of a variable. So in this program, the scope of the variable. So in this program we have a lot of variables. So var1, var2, var3, var4. These variables, especially for this one, this is a global variable. This is also a global variable. This is a global variable, and finally var4 is a global variable when I first initialize. Because up here I'm assigning 1 to var1, so this number 1 is going to be assigned in memory. And for Python, that's great because we don't actually have to worry about memory management, because Python takes care of that for us. And down here we initialize 2 to var2, and then 3 to var3, and then 4 to var4. So we have those 4 variables already initialized. So after being initialized in the address, as you can see, I have a lot of levels. As you can see, so level 1 at the topmost level. Inside the while loop we have level 2. The for loop we're in level 3, and then finally the for loop in level 4, and I did it twice right here. And then down here, as you remember from the while clause, in order to evaluate the expression inside of the while clause, I have to initialize or use a variable that I assigned some value beforehand. So I did that. So it's testing to see if while 1 is not equal to 3, it'll go into this while loop. And then it has to have some way to get out of the while loop, so that at the very end of the while loop I'm incrementing var1 by 1, or augmenting it or accumulating it by a value of 1. So that's a way to get out of the while loop, so it won't go into infinity. So we saw that a lot beforehand, but this one we're gonna look at the scope, and I'm just gonna show you that all of these variables can be accessed anywhere inside of this program. Even though I have this under the while loop, I have this var4 under the for loop. This var4 can be accessed anywhere inside of the source code itself. So we got our output right here. So up here I'm saying level 1 var1 is var1, so this will only output once because it doesn't have a loop. And then down here we initialize 2 to be in var2, or we assign 2 to var2, and then down here it says print level 2 var2 is 2, and then down here we got 3 assigned to var3, and then we get this output, level 3 var3 is 3 right here. And then we get into this for loop, which has a list, which we saw like a couple tutorials back. This will only iterate twice because this list only has 2 elements. Now I haven't really talked about list. I will talk about list later on, not in this tutorial, but way later on. So don't worry about this. Just know that this has 2 elements, and so that means this for clause will iterate or loop twice. So the body here will loop twice. So we got 3 here, and the next one should be 4, and then the next one finally should be 2. Because we're saying level 4 var2 is var2, we're accessing this global variable even though this variable var2 is under the while clause up here. We're accessing it. Again, it's as I said before, all these variables are global variables. As long as you initialize it some value first, you can use it anywhere in the program. So showing you right there. But if I said, like right here, I said print var4, I actually couldn't do that because when it goes through the program first and it reaches at this line, when it's going through the program first, it goes to while clause and then in the for clause, and then reaches this line, var4 is actually not initialized. Okay, it's initialized down here, so this isn't in memory, so it should give me an error unless I'm crazy. So yeah, so var4 is giving var4 is not defined because I called it before I defined it, this global variable here. So that's why I can't do that right here. So I'm just showing you that you can access, especially right here, I was showing you right here, you can access a variable even though it looks like it's initialized under a body, as you can see, this is initialized under the while body. So you might think, oh, well, I can't access var2 right here if I'm outside the while clause. So if we go outside the while loop, if we do, if I'm not crazy, I should access var2 because it should be a global variable unless I'm crazy. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So print var2, the last one should be accessing when I initialize inside of the while loop. But I'm actually accessing it, even though I initialize inside the while loop, its scope is the whole program, as you can see. Because this is initialized within the global scope of the whole program. Okay. And so if I go up here and I actually put this whole thing, all these levels inside of a function. So if we do def, let me think. So if we did that and make sure to iterate everything, so it knows that it's under, it knows that its indentation is correct. So it knows which body it's under. It's got to make sure this one's under the while body, and make sure this is under as well. And if I run this and make sure to actually, because we define the function, so we got to call it. So call the function after we defined it. So func 1, and then we run the module. It should give me the same output unless I messed up. Okay, so it gives me the same output. So the only difference that we saw beforehand was that I just put everything inside of this function. Again, as I said before, without this function, all these variables right here are global in scope. Okay, but let's say I move this out of the function. So as you can see, this is not lined up with defining this function. So this printing var2 is not part of the defining the function. So when I call the function, what will happen is it'll go line by line to put this in memory, and then once it reaches down here, it will try to print var2 in the global scope, but var2 isn't in the global scope before ever reaching the func1. So yeah, there we go. So as you can see, it never runs because it tries to print var2, but it's not initialized in this program, because I try to print this in the global scope. All these variables inside of here, I'm sorry, this one, and this one are inside of the function. So all of these variables, which are called local variables, they're local to the func1 function. Right. So if I put this, actually, if I iterate this or indent this back into this function, it'll work again. But in order for this particular line to work, I actually have to initialize it outside. So so like that, for example. Now it'll work. It'll give me that global variable content, which is 7, or the value that's stored inside of this variable. So it'll print 7, and then it'll run the function. Yep. So the first one's 7, and it'll give me what's inside of the function. And yeah, if you want to actually return something that's, like, if you want to return a local variable that contains some value like var1, if I wanted to return that, as you saw beforehand, just put in a return statement at the end of the function. So like, let's see, if I wanted to, if I type it right, return var2, right? So if I return var2 inside of here, and then when I call this function here, this function will give me the value, which is var2. So var2 should be 2, return 2, so this will give me 2. So if I put this right here, func1, and don't call this, and then it'll print out. So what will happen is I put in a return statement. I'm returning a local variable var2, which is 2, and it'll run this whole process right here. So it'll run the body of this function right here, and then after doing that, because it has to go through this while loop, right, the while body right here, over and over and over and over and over again, and then it'll go down here and say return var2. So this variable that contains 2 right here, this is a local variable var2, returns as I call this function, because I define it first, I call the function, this function will return the value that's contained inside of var2. That 2 that I just returned, so pretty much you can think of this as 2. 2 is assigned to var2. As you can see, I used 2 variables that are the same name. But there is no conflict because the scope of this local variable var2, the scope is within this function right here. But the scope of this variable right here, which is var2, its scope is actually outside of the function, if I remember correctly. So yeah, so we run, it'll give me 2, and then assign it to var2. So, or maybe it isn't. Hold on. I'm actually winging it today, so that's why kind of shaky. If I did print var2, but I might be wrong about that, because, or maybe not. But yeah, anyways, I can't print var2 because it's not initialized. So yeah, talking about the local variables, yeah, here this is within the scope of this function, and this right here should be, the scope should be all over the program. So I actually won't be putting this back into here because when this is interpreted, it has to be interpreted and put into memory. So this, I have to define the function first before I call it, right? So this will actually be in memory. Okay, so since this is in memory, I call this function which is in memory, so it gets all of this content right here. And then you return var2 and get the value. So yeah, so I was thinking that, oh, maybe I can just put var2 back into here, but that's not the case because you can't do that. So I can't say, okay, well, var2 can go back into here. That's not possible. So yeah, okay, so the scope that I was talking about still stands. So yeah, that's it. Unless there's something else that I missed, which I don't think there is. But yeah, so printing var2, you get it right there from the function itself. Here's another one. If you return var2 like in the middle of the program, so let's see. Let's say I assign it 2 right here, but I said return var2 right here, and then comment this out right here. Well, what will happen is if it reaches this return statement in the middle of this function, the output should only be this right here, because once it reaches the return statement, it'll get out of the function completely. So yeah, there you go. So it'll get out of the function completely. So we only get the output of level 1 var1 is this right here. And then we return var2, which we assign to, as you can see. So that's the only output. When it reaches the return statement inside of the function, it'll get out of the function completely. And this will never run. So if we run this again, it should still give me the same output because it'll never see this again. So yeah, even though I have 2 return statements, which is unconventional, it'll find this return statement first, and it'll get out of the function completely. But again, if I remove this, that won't be the case. it'll give me the normal output. So the reason why I actually initialized this inside of the while loop and then inside of the for loop and then the next one, I did that because I think some people were confused as to probably wondering, oh, if I initialize a variable inside of a while loop, for example, and I was talking about now we're inside of the body of the while loop. And so if you're inside the body loop, if I initialize a variable like I did right here, what's the scope? So that's what I was trying to clear up, was that even though you're initializing a variable inside of a body of a while loop or for loop, doesn't matter how many levels you're underneath. I can be on level 100, right? But I can still access var2 up here, which is on level 2 directly. As long as it's initialized first, and I call var2 from level 100, way down here, I will still be able to access it, because the scope of this variable inside of this function, if I made 100 for loops, for example, 100 different levels of for loops, I would still be able to access var2 because the scope of var2 is within the body of the within the function func1. So that's its scope. But this variable right here, var2, its scope is actually all over the program, except for in the side of this function, because it can't go inside the function. But anything else that I print out, or while loop, for loop, after this, the scope for this will be whatever is after this. So I can go down here and say print var1. I couldn't do that because var1 is defined inside this function. I have no access to it, and it'll throw me an error. So yeah, and that's it. Yeah, that's it. So that's all that we talked about before. Is that's the scope that I wanted to cover today. So I'm going to go into other things as well, like into other modules or source code. And if you include a source code, then I would have to discuss the scope of that as well. But for now, what you've already seen, the scope is what I just talked about right here. So yeah, that should make programming a lot easier for you guys. So yeah, so I'll see you guys in the next tutorial.